Good morning. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Garrison Church of God and from the Riverdale Community Church. I'm glad you've chosen to join me this morning. This is a beautiful, beautiful day that we've been given, and we have much to be thankful for. I want to talk to you about my last message in this particular series of Thoughts of Ethan from Psalm 89. Today we're going to be talking about loving kindness walks through the darkness, and we'll be looking at the last few verses of that particular psalm for our thoughts. We live in a world that, due to the darkness, does not appreciate the Christian faith. But as we display God's loving kindness in this world, we give witness to who Jesus is. I've been talking to you about Ethan, and his name means optimistic one or steadfast one, and talking to you about when I believe this particular psalm was written. I believe it was probably written in the last few days the last few years of David's life, when his physical impairments with his memory and with his circulatory issues became quite apparent to everybody. And there was a struggle for who would control the throne, whether his half-brother, whether Solomon's half-brother, Adonijah, or whether Solomon would succeed to the throne. And David tried to settle the dispute by placing Solomon as co-regent. There was still a lot of jockeying for position, a lot of people trying to figure out what it was going to be like for them in a Solomon administration rather than a David administration. Many of them that preferred Adonijah, frankly, to Solomon. They didn't think Solomon, because of his youth and inexperience, was up to the job. So there are a lot of struggles that are going on at this particular time. And the man Ethan shares his concern in this psalm about what is happening in his world, the troubles and the struggles and some of the darkness that very much characterizes the world that he feels that he lives in. One of the powerful things about this psalm is that Ethan, 7 times in this psalm, uses a word from the Hebrew that is quite unique. It's the word chesed. It is a word that is hard to translate. In fact, many centuries ago, when they first began translating the Bible into English, a man invented a word, loving kindness, in an attempt to try and reflect the meaning of this particular word. The problem is that the word chesed has a very broad meaning in the Old Testament and is very difficult to translate with an English word. It can mean anything from mercy to love to care. It can even have a negative connotation to it, meaning almost dislike for. So there are a lot of different ways in which this word can be used depending on the context in which it is used and the intent of the writer. So you have to understand it in that broad sense. But generally, the word loving kindness is probably one of the best translations for it. When it was translated into the Septuagint, it was most often translated as mercy. However, that doesn't quite reflect the entire nature of this particular word. What the writer Ethan indicates for us is that through life, one of the most important things that you can live with in your decision-making process is an understanding of the loving kindness of God. God's loving kindness is what directs us through the darkness of our world. Because it is very often easy to become discouraged, frustrated, angry, or hurt by the circumstances that we live with day in and day out. But for Christians, if loving kindness is at the very bottom or the very center of what we do, then we will find that we are able to deal better with the circumstances around us. David had gone through a very difficult time, and probably Ethan knew of this or had actually lived through that experience. It was the rebellion under Absalom. Absalom was one of David's elder sons. He was a very handsome, able, skilled man. But he decided that David was too weak and unable to lead Israel with the kind of moral authority, especially after David's failure with Bathsheba. And so he decided to place himself on the throne. That had taken place about 15 years before this particular incident or this particular psalm was written, at least in my opinion. Absalom had called to his side a man by the name of Ahithophel. Ahithophel was David's best counselor. He was the man that David trusted. His wisdom and his understanding was stated as being as if it were the very words of God when he spoke. So Ahithophel was a tremendously able and skilled counselor. He had good wisdom, good insight, good direction in life. But Ahithophel, for some reason, became disenchanted with David. Perhaps it was the incident over Bathsheba that disenchanted him. Perhaps it was his failure to deal with the struggles in his own family. We don't know exactly what prompted Ahithophel, but Ahithophel joined Absalom's rebellion. And it was something that frightened David considerably, because he knew Ahithophel's wisdom would endanger him and endanger his future as king. In fact, at one point you have him praying against Ahithophel, asking God to confound his counsel. Eventually, David will send back another personal counselor, Hushai, who is sort of a spy inside of Absalom's inner court. And there he will confound Ahithophel's advice. Ahithophel, because of his anger with David, whether it is mercenary in nature, that he simply was looking for a better position or more remuneration for his services, or whether he was vindictive toward David. We do not know exactly why Ahithophel chose to abandon David and join the rebellion against him. But we see in his circumstance in 2 Samuel what happens when wisdom is used improperly. Wisdom is a tremendous word, or tremendous concept actually. Within Hebrew, there are a lot of different words that are translated with our English word wisdom from the Hebrew language. The most common one is chachma. It simply means the application of what you know to life's circumstances so that you can use good judgment. That requires several different things from us as Christians. It requires that we understand what wisdom really entails. Wisdom demands that we understand a few things. If we are going to be wise people, we must first have an understanding of what is exactly happening. The Hebrew calls that bina. It's literally perception, the ability to perceive what is really happening. A lot of people have knowledge, but they lack insight or perception, and that is a dangerous combination. Just because you know a lot doesn't mean you are wise. Wisdom is something that is the ability to understand what is exactly happening. Another thing that the Hebrew word demands is discretion. Discretion is knowing the right moment and the right circumstances in which to use the knowledge you have. That's discretion. A lot of people that have a lot of knowledge and even quite a bit of insight at times lack discretion in how they use that information. As a result, they often do more damage than good, not only to others, but to themselves. Wisdom also demands that we have good judgment. Good judgment means the ability to look at circumstances and figure out what really is important and what is not important. A lot of people lack good judgment. We call it common sense. The idea that this is not an important issue to spend my time, my effort, and my resources on. Very often people will, as Jesus said, strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, because the idea is that everything is important, but not everything really is important. And wisdom demands that we know the difference between what is important and what is not important. Those things make for wisdom. But wisdom is a double-edged sword in the Hebrew. On the one side, it is godly and directed toward good purposes. But wisdom may also be used for great evil, and we see that in the man Ahithophel. Wisdom can become what we call cunning. Cunning is the ability to use that wisdom, that your God-given ability to apply the knowledge you have in life to, well, evil ends. And that's a sad thing. When we apply our knowledge to completely selfish and self-centered ends, that is cunning. And cunning often destroys other people. And as the writer of Proverbs mentions many times, it often destroys us. What keeps us from slipping into this trap of cunning in our wisdom? Well, there's one thing. And the writer of Proverbs is pretty strong on this. It's the loving kindness of God that has been infused into our hearts. If we have a good intent at the bottom of our wisdom, we will not fall into the trap of cunning. No matter how wise we are, we will not use that wisdom simply in a self-centered way and destroy others and eventually ourselves in the process. I've known quite a few people in my life that I consider wise. David was privileged with some tremendous wise men that surrounded him. Solomon also clearly had wise counselors and wise people that surrounded his life. We need to surround ourselves with people who are wise, not cunning. There were other cunning men around David. Joab, he was a cunning man, but ultimately it led to his destruction. And if we become self-centered in our wisdom, it will lead to our destruction. God has called us to walk through this dark world with loving kindness, with an intent to do good. Jesus would put it this way: be as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. God bless you. Hope you see us today for church.